Israel and Palestine have been in conflict for 70 years. It's been so long that many people don't even know what the fight is about and why anymore. However, one thing you must have noticed is that Israel has a strong military force. According to some statistics from 2021, it is the 14th strongest military in the world. Besides that, it has definite support from several other major military forces, such as the United States, which has the strongest military in the world. On the other side of this story is Palestine, which only has a few resistance groups for its military power. Groups that can be easily defeated by these powerful armies. And then there are some people who sometimes threw sticks and stones, which I do not think is a very big deal. So, why doesn't this powerful military, with support from other powerful countries, just destroy Palestine and end it? It could end a 70-year war, create security for its people, expand the territory even more, and the Palestinian people would either have to live peacefully in this country under this government or move to neighboring Arab countries if they don't want to. Why doesn't Israel do this? This video is about whether Israel really can't defeat Palestine, or if it can, why doesn't it? Well, let's start this story. As you know, Judaism is a religion like Islam, but much older. Jerusalem is the name of the city in this region that we will soon talk about. This city is considered holy for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. For Jews, it is a city where their prophets were. Many of them believe that God lived there and that it was the center of the world. And they still worship Jerusalem like Muslims worship facing Mecca. For Christians, it is a holy city because Christ was there, was crucified there, and it is said that he ascended heaven from there. Their Holy Mary is also buried there. For Muslims, it is a holy city because their prophets were there at different times. And interestingly, the first Qibla of Muslims was also there, until it was later moved to Kaaba. But even today, because of the presence of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it is considered the third holiest city for Muslims after Mecca and Medina. On the other hand, Christians hated Jews very much because simply they believed that Jews killed Christ, or according to some narratives, trapped him for the Roman Empire to kill him. Christians' hatred of Jews also had many social reasons. One of the most important reasons seemed to be that they were a very close and a wealthy group. Being wealthy means that they had more facilities and powers. And being a closed group meant that not everyone could become a Jew and join them. Either you had to be born a Jew, or they had to accept that you were now also a Jew, which they didn't do. Therefore, it was natural that when such a closed group existed, the rest of the society would guard against them. And at that time, religion and sked were everything. The result was that when Christians hated Jews, it particularly meant that the large part of society hated another part of it. Besides this religion hatred, these religions were also not very compatible with each other. Jews did many things that were forbidden in the eyes of the Christians. And in a society where religion was everything, this also increased the distance and hatred between them. The distance and hatred gradually increased over time, and eventually what happened was that in Europe, where most people were Christians, people began to hate Jews. They harassed them. They were not allowed to own anything. In many cases, if they could, they would kill them because they thought Jews were the cause of many miseries. Up to this point, it is clear that the situation was very complicated. But surprisingly, this religious complexity is not what created today's problems. Even if we skip a few hundred years of history and come to the year 1850, in the same city of Jerusalem, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, About half of the people were Muslims, 30% Christians, and 20% Jewish. They all lived together in Jerusalem, and it was known as a region where people with different religions lived together in peace. Religious ceremonies were held for all three groups, and there was no special conflict. But 40 or 50 years later, in this region, a group of Arabs gradually introduced themselves as a nation and country called Palestine. Almost simultaneously, Jews in Europe had a similar idea that Judaism is not just a religion but an identity and nationality. We Jews need our own country and can't live like this. This belief that Jews need their own country is called Zionism, and its founders formed a group called the Zionist Organization and began to promote this idea. As we explained about Jews not having a decent life in Europe, more and more Jews joined this movement to have their own country and live in peace. They thought the Middle East, which was the historical land of the religion, would be a good place. As a result, tens of thousands of Jews went to the Middle East, to those lands that, as we said, were under the control of Ottoman Empire. Then World War I happened, and the Ottoman Empire completely collapsed, and Britain took over the era. But before Britain could successfully take over the era, and while it was still involved in the war, because it needed the support of Jews, it told the Zionist organization, "You want a country? That era is yours." Why did they do this? Because they wanted the support of the Zionist organization. And why did they want that? Because they needed America's help to win the war. And how are these connected? The connection is that the Zionist organization could convince America to help Britain. How? With money. Historically, Jews have been one of the wealthiest group, and even now to some extent they are. Why? Because as we said, Jews were not allowed to own a land. One of the things that they couldn't own was land, and earning income without owning land was very difficult at the time. As a result, they had to find other ways to make money, which was trading various goods. Apart from being very profitable, they also established many industries. Even now, in some cases, Jews control many trade markets. But most importantly, unlike other religions, usury was not forbidden in Judaism. As a result, they quickly saw the idea of lending money as a job. And after the concept of banking emerged, because they were allowed to practice usury, they quickly established many banks and lent money to others, getting it back with more interest and becoming wealthier. Although the religious aspects of people's lives disappeared a few years later, Jews were several years ahead of others in banking industry. In any case, they were wealthy, and the Zionist organization was effectively composed of powerful Jews, meaning the organization was exceptionally wealthy. They accepted Britain's promise, and through a series of negotiations that were not well documented, America was suddenly convinced to help Britain in World War I, and the Ottoman Empire was defeated. But one of the problems was that the Britain had promised that land to several parties, not just the Zionist organization. It had promised France that they would divide the Arab region and Britain would govern Palestine. It had also promised Saudi Arabia that if they helped Britain win, they would get Palestine, and they did help. In the end, the war ended, and Britain finally took over the era but decided to keep it for itself for a while and not give it to anyone to see what would happen. However, considering the promise it had made before, it allowed Jews to migrate to that era if they wanted to and live there, which wasn't a big deal because Jews were already there. But suddenly, about 300,000 Jews migrated there, making things a bit difficult. Since they had money, they started buying a lot of land, and some areas completely fell into their hands. which led to Arab protests and violence broke out. Finally, Britain decided to suppress Arab protests firmly and also stop Jewish immigration for a while. Naturally, Jews were not happy with this either, leading to their protests as well. By protest, I don't mean demonstration and marches. They formed armed groups and also reached the brink of fighting. After World War II and the Holocaust, considering that one of the countries decided to, kill all the Jews in the world, and their leader didn't live long enough to get more than 6 million of them, a lot more Jews felt that Europe was no longer a place for them to live and decided to migrate to this land to have a normal life. World War II ended, but these troubles did not. Britain also concluded that this land was too troublesome and decided to let it go and leave its fate in the hand of a newly established United Nations. The United Nations decided to partition the land and divide it into 2 parts. One part for Arabs, called Palestine, and one part for the Jews, officially called Israel. Except for Jerusalem, which, as we said, was a special city and holy for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, it remained an international city belonging to neither of those two. In speech, it seems reasonable, but in practice, the demarcation was such that if you show this to anyone, the first guess would likely be that this is not going to end well. And indeed, it didn't. The demarcation practically gave each country 3 separate eras, but more importantly, a significant portion of the land given to Palestine was barren. One of the main issues was that Israel had already formed numerous military units and practically had an army long before this demarcation was to be implemented, and an official state was to be established. This situation was not favorable to the Arabs of the region because although it seems on paper that the decision was made by a neutral international organization and they had fairly drawn these borders, in practice, it seems that Israel, by forming a military force in the region and purchasing a lot of land, had established its presence in this territory. The United Nations, whether there was a behind-the-scene arrangement or not, had no choice but to formalize Israel's presence. As a result of this dissatisfaction among the Arabs in the region, several nearby countries such as Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Palestine decided to jointly attack Israel to reclaim the territories and restore them to the Arabs, teaching the world a lesson that no one can enter their land and establish a country for themselves, officially or unofficially. However, this project failed miserably, and not only did they fail to reclaim those lands from Israel, but Israel managed to gain 30% more territory than what had been given to it that year, which itself was an evidence that Israel had been gathering its military force in the era long before these discussions. Although during this particular war, the British provided serious assistance to Israel to ensure that it did not lose its territory, the more significant issue for the Palestinians than losing those lands was that 700,000 Palestinians lost their homes and were forced to seek refuge in neighboring countries. At the end of this Arab-Israeli war, Israel captured all the territories except for this region called Gaza, which fell into Egyptians' hand, and this region called the West Bank, which fell into Jordanians' hand. 20 years later, the Arabs decided once again to attack Israel to show that they would not allow any foreign presence and to reclaim those lands. This time, they also suffered a severe defeat, and Israel not only took all the territory including Gaza and the West Bank, which it had not controlled before, but also captured a large part of Egypt and an area in Syria called the Golan Heights. A few years later, another event occurred. The United States facilitated a secret negotiation with Egypt. convincing Egypt that being allied with Israel was more beneficial than being its enemy. Consequently, Egypt decided it no longer had an interest in this war and signed a peace arrangement with Israel in the United States. Because of this, Israel returned the territories it had taken from Egypt to maintain their friendship. As you can imagine, such an action by Egypt was very offensive to other Arabs, and the president of Egypt was assassinated shortly thereafter. Nonetheless, from that point onward, other Arabs gradually felt it might be better not to engage too much with Israel, and some of them signed peace arrangements over the next few years. Some withdrew from conflict without officially signing any arrangement, and in summary, no one else bothered them. The conflict in that region becomes solely between Palestine and Israel. When Palestine was left without a state and without an army, internal resistance groups became more prominent. The main group was a group called PLO, or Palestine Liberation Organization, which practically introduced itself as a representative of Palestine and tried to fight for it. Meanwhile, an important event was occurring. A large number of Israelis were moving entirely to the lands that, according to United Nations, belonged to Palestine. One reason for the acceleration of their relocation was that the Israeli government was financially supporting them to do so. Gradually, this issue became official, and the Israeli military forces also got involved, evacuating Palestinians from their homes to use those areas for building homes for Israelis. One of the main impacts and perhaps even goal of the Israelis in doing this was to separate and distance Palestinians from each other so that they themselves would not know which part of the land belonged to them. Other countries considered Israel's actions illegal and contrary to what the United Nations had declared and repeatedly complained about it. However, Israel claimed that in reality, its actions were not illegal because there was no such thing as Palestine. The United States also supported Israel, and this situation continues to this day. Meanwhile, another military group called Hamas gained power, believing that the PLO was acting too friendly with the Israelis and preferred military action. But at the same time, it tried to work for people by doing things like building hospitals, schools, and mosques for Palestinian people, thus gaining some credibility for itself. A few years later, about 30 years ago, the talk of negotiations and peace became more serious, and a peace arrangement called Oslo was signed between Israel and Palestine. Naturally, it was not the best possible arrangement for Palestine, and practically no special concessions were given to Palestine. But for Palestine, that was practically being destroyed, it was better than nothing. However, there were staunch opponents to such peace on both sides. On the Palestinian side, the main opponent was Hamas, which believed that this arrangement was an injustice to Palestine and preferred the military route. Some Palestinian people were also unhappy with the peace and believed that since Palestine practically had no specific government and no force left for it, Israel was taking advantage of the situation and wanted to formalize the current bad situation completely. As a result, they began to confront the military forces in the streets and gradually restored to other methods, such as boycotting Israeli services and goods. These conflicts, aided by Hamas, led to Hamas gaining more power and credibility among people. Interestingly, even in Israel, a particular group of likely more radical citizens opposed such peace. They held many protests, and subsequently, the Israeli prime minister was assassinated at a conference relating to this peace arrangement. More conflicts ensued, but both sides lost hope for peace. Hamas completely separated from Palestine government and managed to take control of Gaza. Israel agreed and built a high wall around Gaza, while in other areas it returned to its previous but slightly more militarized state. meaning that Palestinian homes were still taken from them and their lands were used for Israeli constructions. Additionally, their movements were controlled by Israeli forces on the streets. Most of what we hear today about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict relates to this Gaza Strip, and the photos and videos we sometimes see of direct confrontations between people and Israeli forces are related to these remaining eras where Israelis are still building settlements. All of these was a story of the past decades that gives us a clearer picture of exactly how things turned out the way they did and the current state of affairs. Now that we have reached today, there is a question we want to answer. As we have seen, Israel had a strong army for several decades and had managed to maintain one of the strongest armies in the world over time. Why does this powerful army, which does not place much importance on Palestinians, not end the issue once and for all? Eradicate the entire matter, and instead of maintaining the current half-hearted state like now, where it keeps building settlements here and there and taking people's homes, suddenly demolish all the houses and expel all the people, making the entire country its own? The obvious answer to this question is that not eradicating Palestine benefits Israel more than eradicating it. This is completely natural. Now the benefits of eradicating Palestine is clear. No more war, no need to spend so much money, citizens feel more secure, and in the end, they will have a larger territory. With this in mind, what is the benefit of not eradicating Palestine? Let me tell a story. During World War II, North Korea invented some techniques to get American prisoners to confess. They were simple but very effective methods. For example, a person was forced to lean against a crooked wall for 8 hours or sit on the edge of the chair if they wanted to sit. Although these actions did not seem difficult, over long periods, they were so annoying that the prison would confess to things they had not even done, just to get out of the situation. The important point was that many of them later did not even know what had happened and made them confess, and they did not feel they had been tortured. At the same time, German spies did something similar. They would go into their opponents' homes and simply move things around. Doing something as simple as that caused people not to have peace and mental focus because they were confused even in their own homes. What is the point of these stories? It's important to know that now, unlike a few hundred years ago, the meaning of war is not just cannons, tanks, swords, and guns. Over the past few hundred years, countries have learned that they can achieve very good results and sometimes even better results than physical war through psychological warfare. These are not accidents. These are not spontaneous ideas of a soldier. All these armies spend a lot on these matters and have psychology, sociology teams developing science and new techniques to be used. Some techniques are short-term, like these mental torture methods for obtaining confession, while some are very long-term. Now, although these psychological techniques are created scientifically and based on previous experiences, they also need to be tested for governments to know whether they work or not. Now in today's world, unlike the time of World War II, countries do not take people from their countries as prisoners. So how can they test these things? They can't do it on their own people. Imagine if there were a group of people in a situation where the country could experiment with these methods on them and see the results without worrying about international complaints because they were not an official country, and on the other hand, their existence was useful, and on the other hand, their elimination might cause the world to complain and interfere. What a better situation it would be! There would be no group of people better than Palestine for such experiment. While psychological warfare techniques are important, military warfare is still very significant. It would be great if there were a way to test our military techniques somewhere to ensure their effectiveness and to show other countries our new military advances so they might buy from us. Where can we do this? Other countries usually do not allow missiles tests under soil. But here, we can fire as many missiles as we want, whenever we want, and install new systems. This is good, but it would be even better if we could train our forces while testing our techniques and systems as well. For example, I need a lot of soldiers, police, and such. While I can train them in normal condition, training them in a real combat situation would be excellent. As you might have guessed, Palestine is a very good place for this purpose as well. For years, many American police officers have been conducting their training courses in Palestine because there are many real combat situations there, and this has become a serious business for Israel. Instead of other countries coming into Palestine to conduct these tests, Israel does it for them and sells the result. This is part of the theories of Master Jeff Halper in his book War Against the People, based on evidence from the world such as the frequent arm exhibitions that Israel holds and police forces from America that to go to Israel every year for training. The arm contracts that these countries have signed with Israel include one from Azerbaijan, which has few months ago was at war with Armenia and easily defeated them. The final point, if you remember, is that the only commonality among the people who migrated to this land was their religion. They come from different countries, sometimes with different cultures and lifestyles, simply because they were Jewish and wanted to escape the pressure of living in countries that did not accept them. Setting aside these cultural differences, even being Jewish is not a uniform identity. There are 3 different types of Jews there: Ashkenazi, Haredi, and Mizrahi. These names aren't really important. What's important is that they have different beliefs and lifestyles. One group is very religious, wears their own specific clothes, adheres to old customs, keep men and women completely separate, considers women to belong to their husbands, avoid technology as much as possible, and so on. On the other hand, another group does not believe in these costumes, and Judaism is just an identity from the past that they find meaningless and outdated. This disagreement might not be such a big deal in an ideal situation, but in this non-ideal situation, it is a significant issue. The reasons are historical and mainly go back to who migrated to this land first. What matters is that today, the people of Israel come not only from many different countries with various cultures and lifestyles, but also have 3 completely different religious beliefs that do not accept each other's lifestyles. Over time, the government has learned that having Palestine next to us with some resistance groups that occasionally fire rockets isn't such a bad thing. It seems to make people realize that even though they have different historical backgrounds, in the end, they are all Israelis and need to be united, which helps the country be managed better, more easily, and with fewer problems. Our religious and cultural rebellions are also decreased significantly. So why not? This is another theory about the benefit Israel gains from keeping Palestine alive, as explained by Mr. Zizit in his book. In the end, what seems interesting is that analysts believe that Israel did not form with these intentions from the beginning, and these are the twists and turns that have emerged over time. However, they also believe that this current situation cannot last forever and cannot become permanent. But it seems they have held this belief for at least 10 years, and so far, no changes have occurred in this situation. Thanks for being with me till the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and also press the notification bell. See you all in the next video. Take care. Bye.